Thank you for that introduction. One of the things that I notice is how when you ask people to talk about grief, they end up talking about how difficult it is to talk about it. Why do you think that is?
I'm wary of providing sort of single univocal answers to any questions about grief, just because it always turns out to be so variable, and there are possibly a range of different reasons. But I think one of these is something that we can get at by referring to phenomenological philosophy. So for the most part, you might say we take a kind of world for granted, a practically significant world structured by our habits, our expectations, our projects, and our relations. So we talk about things in the context of this shared world. It operates as a kind of background. And we face a very different linguistic challenge when it's the disruption of that very world that we're faced with. How do you describe the loss of what you previously took for granted? And it's also exacerbated by the fact that this loss profoundly affects our relations with others. So others may seem distant. The task of communicating with them may seem even more daunting. It's as though one's own world has been shattered, and yet their lives may carry on uninterrupted as before. There's this bizarreness to it, the gulf between one's own world and theirs. And language can do very strange things as well, where you try to say something and it repeatedly backfires. An example I use quite a lot in the book is that of somebody going home from the hospital with her dead husband's possessions and asking, how does that even make sense? How can I say that I'm going home after this? How can I go home to this place where we live, our home, with his possessions now he's died? As if one's words themselves are torn apart by this clash between worlds, the world before and after the bereavement. So those are just some thoughts, but I guess there's a lot more to say here. I mean, is there anything you want to add on this?
I mean, I certainly think that that's the case, and maybe it's the whole background of a shattered world doesn't seem intelligible to a person whose world isn't shattered. And even though there might be things you can say, it doesn't seem obvious that you're going to be able to get the context across for reasons like the ones that you've just pointed out. I mean, going home to someone who isn't involved, it seems perfectly reasonable to say, I'm going home. You're going to the same house that you always did. But in terms of its significance that it has to the person going through grief, it's completely different.
Yeah.
Now, you are the primary investigator of a whole project on grief. How do you define grief when you are just trying to describe what it is you're talking about?
How do I define grief?
What is it?
Yes, I mean, I think one of the problems we have is that the term grief is used in everyday discourse in different ways. So grief is sometimes used to refer to the experience of loss in general. So I could suffer grief over loss of my home, grief due to losses suffered due to illness, grief over the breakdown of a relationship. And yet grief is also used more specifically in relation to bereavement. And I'm happy to accommodate both uses. I think bereavement has a lot in common with losses more generally, and yet it's distinctive in various ways because of the specifically personal dimensions of loss. So yeah, grief involves a kind of process. And I think that one question philosophers often ask is, what's the object of emotion? An emotion, a concrete object or a formal object? What's it about? What's it directed at? And my own approach is to suggest that grief is directed at a loss of possibilities, which is something that one comprehends and navigates over time. And that this involves the loss of possibilities for oneself, for others, for us. But sorry, that's not a very specific answer, I'm afraid.
No, right. But it's interesting that you both say that you don't think of it as an emotion, and yet in some sense you take it as a kind of paradigm for thinking about emotions more broadly. How do you make sense of that?
Yeah, sorry, I should have been clearer about that. So I think there's an overemphasis in a lot of philosophy on brief emotional episodes, abstracted from their broader context. So a lot of the literature on emotions is concerned with, sort of rather superficial things, like Brenda is happy that it's her birthday, and Jack is happy that he is home from work, and Sarah is sad that she didn't get the job, that kind of thing. So you look at these episodes abstracted from their wider context, and we find this in various scientific circles as well. So when I said that grief isn't an emotion, what I should have said is that grief isn't a brief episodic emotion. Grief is a structured, and I think to varying degrees, unified emotional process. And when it comes to human emotional life, and more specifically the phenomenology, I think it probably is more informative to think of emotions in this way, to look at the dynamics of emotion, the way in which emotion is experienced as dynamic, the way in what we experience emotionally at one time involves a sense of how an emotional process might unfold. So I think grief is experience. Grief isn't just dynamic, it's experienced as dynamic, as a process. And I've been thinking a lot more about this recently, that rather than sort of trying to enumerate various emotions and wonder what their constituents are. So there's fear, there are these subtypes of fear, here's sadness and its subtypes. Is it a matter of feeling, appraisal, or perception? Maybe we should be looking at the language of movement. We talk about being thrown, stunned, bowled over, and so on. There's this huge lexicon of terms for emotional movement that philosophers haven't really looked at. And I think by looking at emotional processes and their dynamics like this, and the ways in which we navigate upheaval, I think we can get a much richer, more encompassing perspective on human emotional life.
You talk about grief changing the whole world. And in one sense, I think the way a lot of people would tend to look at it, it's the case that the person who's grieving has something strange going on with them, and their connection with various facets of the world is affected by that deleteriously. But I think that isn't your picture of how the world changes. How would you describe the transformation of a world that grief brings about?
Well, I think there are various different aspects to this, and it depends to some extent on the circumstances of the bereavement, the nature of the bereavement, and if you like, the stage one is at during the grieving process. People often talk about this contrast between the world that was and the world that is now, and then what you're doing over time is reconciling the gulf between these realities. So you can think of it as present and past, but this isn't the only contrast. What's also going on is this distinction between your own world, what's happened to you, and the world of others that carries on undisturbed. And this almost involves sort of a sense of being pulled out of a consensus world into which one was previously integrated. This distinction between my world and theirs just wasn't there before. And another important aspect, and I think you've conveyed this as well, is the way in which it's not just that you have world A and world B. It's kind of the place in between where, and this is, I think, philosophically really interesting, what some people seem to describe as, if you like, a collapse of normativity. Wittgenstein talks constantly about knowing how to go on. And I think maybe the contrast case should be something like grief, where one really doesn't know how to go on. There's no fact of the matter about what should come next, because the structure of one's life is to varying degrees eroded. There's just this emptiness, this lack of structure, this lack of direction or prescription. And I think another aspect of the world that has changed is being with another person, if you like, opens up possibilities in distinctive ways. It feels like something to be in a particular place with a particular person. And so, the loss of a relationship is the loss of this sort of more dynamic sense of encountering certain kinds of possibilities in certain ways. Just think about how going for a walk with one person can be radically different in character from going for a walk with someone else. And I don't know whether how far that goes to answering your question, or again, whether we differ here, or there's anything you'd like to add.
Well, I don't think that we necessarily differ. I do find it interesting that so much of what seems to be going on is a kind of breakdown of relationships in general, not just a relationship with the person that's died, which I think is maybe what one initially would tend to think. And of course, other people do, if you're fortunate, try to step in and help the person in various ways, but it doesn't really quite create the transition that one is looking for. I mean, just the whole idea of transitioning to a new normal, as some people might put it, seems problematic when you start analyzing the way that the world as it's being experienced in this kind of middle way doesn't seem to have a shape enough to say, oh, well, now I'm in this new world. And that leads me to the question, do you think grief is a process that comes to an end?
I'm not sure about this. I think certain aspects of grief, one might say, come to an end. But one thing I'm just not sure about is, after many years, one can still feel, quite a profound sense of loss over the death of a person. It's not something that one simply forgets and moves on from at some point. It doesn't have a clear endpoint. So I think, certain aspects of grief, you might say, settle down or do come to an end. There's a process of reorienting oneself within the world, of reorienting one's relationships, perhaps involving a transformation of one's sense of self. And as you say, it's not just a case of sort of stepping into the new normal or something. Many of us will always remember the significance. We'll always remember the significance of what happened, and also the nature of this process of upheaval that changes not just the character of the world we end up in, but if you like, perhaps our whole outlook, in many cases, our whole attitude towards life. But I don't know. I mean, I never really come out and say whether grief has an endpoint or not. I guess maybe I just try to avoid answering that question. So sorry to bat it back at you. Are you inclined to avoid it as well, or do you think you answer this?
I think it doesn't have an endpoint, full stop, as I think many people would like to think that it would. I mean, obviously, if you're distressed by something, it would be nice to think that it's going to come to an end. But some facets of it, yeah, I agree with you. They settle down. I mean, I think it's always hard to explain what's going on when things do seem largely settled down, and suddenly, out of the blue, this overwhelming sense of loss just shows up again. Mm-hmm. And I know that some people are very distressed when they think that they thought they'd made progress and they're back to square one. Do you think that's just the wrong model to be using?
Maybe. I mean, I think another problem, sorry, just to throw more complications into the works rather than answer the question, it's very difficult to individuate experiences of loss. So, when someone dies, you may lose ways of relating to other people, your friendships may change, your habits, your pastimes, your sense of home, perhaps physically where you live, or the job you do, all sorts of things can change. And also, a life can unravel very quickly. You can lose a relationship and then find that you've lost a job, and then find that you've lost a home, and that you've lost all these friendships. Is this a singular experience of loss over which we grieve? Are these multiple losses? And for many of us, experiences of loss that occur at one point in life sort of awaken earlier losses. Do we want to say that they're clearly separate according to one or another criterion? So I don't know. I'm kind of happy to leave things messy, because I think that's the way they are, even though philosophers are often averse to doing that.
Right. Do you think being aware of the kinds of things that you're talking about could be beneficial to someone who's grieving? I mean, does it have practical import?
I mean, I think that philosophers have got something potentially important to do here. So I think a lot of people who are grieving, and I can't give you sort of clear data on this, this is just from talking with people and from reading testimonies. People will say that, they worried there was something wrong with them. Is this normal? Should this be happening? How, I can't make sense of this. This is utterly strange. Do other people feel like that? And perhaps this sense of anxiety, or, and to put it crudely, being worried about going mad, can, exacerbate the suffering of grief, and perhaps indeed feed into the trajectory of grief. So I think a degree of self-understanding is beneficial here, at least the recognition that others go through this. Also, I think this kind of work, it does help us in distinguishing experiences of grief that we might want to refer to as typical in all their diversity, from those where people may require exceptional forms of support. I'm loath to refer to them as pathological. I'm uncomfortable about that. But I think we can, with philosophical work, distinguish, different forms of grief and the ways in which grief might be said to go wrong. Something else we can really do is emphasize the extent to which grief isn't an emotional experience of an individual. It's not something endogenous that just unfolds in some deterministic fashion. Grief as a process is incredibly fragile and susceptible to various changes and perturbations. And it depends to a huge extent on, if you like, a kind of scaffolding, a support structure. And to a large extent, that support structure is dependent upon other people. How one grieves depends on whether there is an enduring sense of connection with others, whether others do provide certain forms of support, whether certain sort of social structures do remain in place. So I think a broader understanding of grief can help us to recognize that and help us to realize that people who are grieving, do depend on others. I mean, I guess not just others. I mean, as you've emphasized so well, people resort to other things such as aesthetic practices, for example, in order to regulate their experiences. But even many of those involve other people in one or another way.
Do you want to say more about that? Like, what do you have in mind?
Well, I suppose, certain aesthetic practices will be culturally established and will involve various cultural norms, and then there'll be roles played that people will play in, initiating people into certain practices. They involve, certain aesthetic practices, I suppose, involve, interacting with each other in certain established ways. So if your world has fallen to bits, you might still find that there are prescriptions there for acting with people that allow one to feel related to them. But I'm kind of loath to go into detail here because I've read your book and I know that you've done it much better than me.
Well, I don't know about that, but at any rate, I'm kind of wondering whether or not depression is related to this. I know you've done previous work on depression. And a lot of times when people are grieving, I think they view themselves as massively depressed. But you distinguish the two. How do you think they differ?
Yes, that's right. I mean, I wouldn't want to sort of distinguish them. I do think there's a lot of overlap, but I think an experience of profound grief in many cases is quite different from an experience of, say, major depression, even though the two may look superficially similar. And again, this becomes clearer when we take a more dynamic perspective upon experience. So what's striking about experiences of grief is the movement, the dynamism, the tension, the contrast between worlds, the perspective shifting. Whereas what we often find in first-person accounts of depression is a sort of stasis. There isn't this dynamism. There aren't these multiple perspectives. There is only the predicament of the depression. There are no possibilities outside of it. And also there are forms of interpersonal experience involved that might look superficially similar, but are often quite different. So for many of those who are depressed, there's a sense of irrevocable disconnection from other people. The possibility of interpersonal connection is no longer part of one's world. And it might seem like that in the accounts of those who are grieving, but often what is lacking are actual interpersonal connections, and a sense of that possibility remains. One can still entertain what it would be to be, what it is to be connected with someone. One can contemplate that possibility. One can remember also what it was like to be connected with the person who died. So I think just sort of emphasizing the dynamic aspects of grief and the interpersonal structure of grief, we can do a lot of work with phenomenology, and we can see differences where sort of much thinner accounts of symptoms will miss those differences altogether.